Well, a chance to try some exercises this afternoon. And that's another opportunity to really see if you've understood what's going on. It's good to see if the compiler never lies, right? It always finds out the gaps in your knowledge, right?
So let's go over this slide again because are we connected?
Yeah, it's okay.
Ready?
Yeah.
Because this is an important one. So we have, we're talking about high bandwidth memory here, HBW, MCD RAM, multi-channel DRAM, 3D stacked memory, something else that we're called. And then the actual brand name for the underlying memory technology that's being used by Intel is 3D Exponent. 3D Exponent will become another form factors as well over the coming months. So option one is to treat the MCD RAM as a cache. Okay, so in that case, we treat it as a last level cache. Data, we use the data locality techniques that we are familiar with for cache blocking, for effective cache utilization. So namely, reusing that data that we have in cache as effectively as possible, because we've set up or configured our MCD RAM to be a cache. And then we also have to take into account that if we set it up as in cache mode, that we will pay a severe penalty if we miss that cache level, i.e. MCD RAM. Okay, so if we miss it and we have to go out to DDR4, we will pay a much higher penalty than we would for a real last level cache. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. The benefit of using MCD RAM in cache mode is that we don't have to worry about programming it. Okay? We don't have to worry about programming MCD RAM explicitly. Everything works out of the box like it does for a typical cache coherent system like x86. The hardware looks after things for us, the compiler looks after things for us. The downside is that if the compiler and the hardware doesn't do a good job of using MCD RAM, we're not going to use it effectively. We're going to underexploit it, okay? Because you as domain specialists, you as the developers of your software, know about which data objects are being used the most, okay? Which ones are going to be particularly important when it comes to bandwidth limitations and so forth. Okay, so with that extra domain knowledge, you can explicitly program MCD RAM and potentially get more benefit from it than the compiler or the hardware could. So that is the other option, to use it in so-called flat mode. If your application fits into 16 gigabytes of capacity, then you can program it by a CTL at runtime. Okay. So all you have to do is add an extra parameter or two to your runtime line, and it'll place all your data objects into MCD RAM. If your data set is larger than 16 gigabytes, then you use these special allocators that I mentioned to you before the break that are available to you via the Memkind library, which is freely available on GitHub and which will be promoted more heavily by Intel over the coming months with their main developers. Okay, so in that sense, instead of using a typical malloc that you're familiar with in C, you'll use something like HBW underscore malloc. And what that does is it allocates the data structure, the data object in MCD RAM rather than DRAM or DDR4. Yep.
Is there a way to use that routine from C++ or in the C++ code?
Yes. It won't have a C++ interface. So it'll be a C-only interface, but you can use it within a C++.
Okay.
And then the other approach for those Fortran programmers, the true believers, is that you can use a directives-based approach. Okay, but as mentioned to you before, that leverages the Memkind library under the hood. So be aware that you have to link to the Memkind library. Because what I've seen people do, I mean, very few people have had access to KNL, so this is all still very new. But from the people that I've talked to that have had access to KNL, one mistake that they often make is they use the directives, the Fortran directives, but they forget to link to the memkind library, and then they don't get any benefit for MCDRAM that they're expecting, and they're wondering what the hell's going on. Okay? So bear that in mind. So we mentioned these cluster modes. So we have two options. We actually have three, but let's talk about two for the moment. We have the Alt-All option. Okay, so these settings, these cluster mode settings, can only be set when you boot up the machine, okay, by the BIOS. Okay. So typically on HPC clusters, you won't have access to that. Okay, you won't have root access. You don't necessarily have to have root access. You might be, you know, the center, the HPC center, or your university might facilitate you booting up the machine to reconfigure the cluster mode on the KML. But it's not guaranteed. It depends on the policy of the center and so forth. Okay? So you can take it that various KNL nodes will come in slightly different configurations. Okay? So the first one is Alt-All, and this is a configuration that is best matched to applications that can scale up to the full thread count on KNL. Okay, because what you've demonstrated there is that the cache coherency between all the L2s, between all those cores, is not a limiting factor for your performance. Okay? Okay. So there you can use the Alt-All. And so there you'll need to, again, localize your data effectively, and you'll have to have exposed enough parallelism in your algorithm to scale across all those threads. Hardware threads. Option 2 is subnuma mode. That's what I want to talk about here. Okay? Because quadrant mode is the default. Okay? But what's more interesting is subnuma mode. And here you would use a NUMA aware code. Okay? So this is something that this is an application that's NUMA aware. You have a first touch policy for your allocations if you're using OpenMP. What it's particularly suited to are MPI-based codes. And don't forget that not every application out there is an MPI application. So within a sub-NUMA configuration, you would typically have one MPI process per sub-NUMA on the KNL. And then you would use some hybrid programming model whereby you would then spawn multiple threads per MPI process within the sub-NUMA mode. Okay, so what that does is it effectively, as I mentioned earlier on, configures the KNL so that it's a 4-socket node. Okay. And what that can alleviate is performance bottlenecks due to having a cache coherency protocol that needs to be very wide over a wide range of cores on the KNL. You basically constrain the KNL so that it's on the socket level, rather than a big many core chip. Okay. So when you read about KNL and you read about the benchmarking that's done on KNL, it might help to make your mind up as to which configuration is best matched to your application. The other way to do it is just trial and error and see what happens. But the one thing to bear in mind here is if your application is not NUMA aware, it won't benefit from the sub-NUMA cluster mode. It has to be NUMA aware. Okay? So using new vector features on KNL. So some points on this. So in many respects, the AVX512 instruction set is not that different to the KNC vector instruction set. We saw it's called IMCI earlier on. Okay. It's certainly a larger instruction set than IMCI, but a lot of the intrinsics or even the lower level instructions that you'll see in AVX512 were already there on the KNC for the MC instruction set. Okay. It's just being extended. So it's now kind of a lot more efficient in terms of like a 512 instruction set. Another point to note is that one of the challenges when it comes to vectorizing code is non-unit stride accesses. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Okay? So your accesses to a data structure are not accesses to contiguous memory locations within that data structure. So they're non-unit stride. They're not unit stride accesses. So in that way, you have to do gathers and scatters, okay, to bring your data into a form that the VPU can effectively operate on, okay? And those gather and scatter instructions are a performance bottleneck in some sense, okay? You pay a penalty for them, just like you do with MPI, gather and scatter instructions. The one thing to note about KNL versus KNC is that the gather and scatter instructions in KNC were software emulated gather and scatter instructions. So you really did pay quite a penalty, whereas now they're hardware supported. So the gather and scatters on KNL are supported by the hardware, okay? So they're not as costly as they were on KNC. You also have conflict detection instructions. I'm not too sure they'll be that useful for scientific computing work, but possibly you have higher precision transcendental support than you did, or better performing higher precision transcendental support than you did on KNC. Okay. And one of the ways you can benefit quite significantly in terms of performance in your software is if you're using transcendentals, and I take it most of you are interested in double precision workloads, then try out using lower precision transcendentals. Okay, so lower precision sines and causes and tans and so forth. Go to single precision and see if you can live with those in terms of the precision of your software. So who's using double precision software here? Pretty much everybody, right? Anyone using single precision? Single precision? Single precision?
Mixed precision.
Mixed precision, okay, so that's interesting. So, do you need to use double precision software?
Yes.
You're sure about that?
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else? Because a lot of people use it and are not completely sure that they just, you know, think that they have to use it, but they don't have to. Because if you don't have to use double precision software, don't use it. Use single precision. You get better performance. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Or as you're using mixed precision, which is interesting. So can I ask you where you're using mixed precision? So where are you using single precision?
Okay. We use double precision for the final result. For instance, okay, we're working on a solver, and you know the precondition is that we use single precision, and but for carrying out the final result, we use double precision.
Okay, and you can get by fine with single precision in terms of accuracy, right? In terms of the accuracy of the result, it's single precision is fine, right?
No, okay, for the results we need double, but for carrying it out we can explore the single.
Okay, sounds interesting. Okay, very good. Automatic, then the other thing to bear in mind with KNL is that you now have these 2 VPUs per core as opposed to just one on the Xeon and one on the KNC as well. So when it comes to vectorization, you have 2 fundamental options. Okay, the first is automatic vectorization. Okay? And there's, you know, when you get down into the nitty-gritty of this, there's not that much automatic about it. Okay, but the idea is that you don't make any changes to your code. You possibly adjust slightly for 512-bit vector weights within your code, and then you recompile with that flag, that switch. So if you want to use ADX512 on the mic on the Z5, you use that switch there. Okay? And there will be, or there already is the equivalent for the Xeon. It's called Xcore, CORE -ADX512. And then there's also a common switch, which lets you run the same software on both Xeon and Xeon 5 without a recompile. And then the second is explicit vectorization. Okay, so when you, what I mean by automatic vectorization is that the compiler does the vectorization for you. Okay. So you can use the flag xmic ADX512 and hope for the best. But the compiler is vectorized the most computing parts of your kernel that you're most interested in. Okay. the line, the clause there, no changes to code, I think it's a bit of a lie, because if you really want to benefit significantly from the VPUs, you typically have to change your code. Okay, but what that doesn't mean necessarily is that you have to use low-level intrinsics to vectorize your code. What it typically means is that you need to refactor your algorithm, albeit with a high-level language like C, C++, but you need to refactor the algorithm so that it's more conducive to vectorization. Okay? So you need to align your data structures. You need to make sure that your accesses are unit stride accesses. So that really involves often quite significant refactoring of kernels. Okay? So automatic vectorization doesn't necessarily imply no changes to code. It can, you want the cheapest route out, just recompile with the switch and hope for the best, as I say. But more often than not, it means significant refactoring of kernels, albeit with a high level language. Same language you're using. The explicit vectorization route means that you use low-level intrinsics. Okay, so are you familiar with vector intrinsics? You've heard about them. Okay, so vector intrinsics are just one level above assembly, essentially. Okay, so they're like wrappers to assembly, essentially. Okay, so I don't recommend using intrinsics. You can get significant performance gains from using intrinsics. There's no doubt about it, but it requires quite a lot of effort. But not only that, you have non-portable code at the end. Okay, because you've targeted a specific vector instruction set explicitly, and your code will not be portable to another vector instruction set. Now, there is a kind of a middle route here. There are vector intrinsic libraries, vectorization libraries out there, C++ libraries, that are that little bit higher level than the vector intrinsics. And they're also, they claim to be, or they hope to be, or they aim to be portable as well. So that if you use the library interface, the actual mapping to the instruction set will be done under the hood. And you would hope that that library will be maintained into the future by the community that's developing it. But I would strongly encourage people to try the higher level routes to vectorization. I don't think in most cases you won't need to use intrinsics. On K and C that has been the case. A lot of people have gone down the intrinsics routes, but they've had to for very specific reasons. It's very, very low level. Okay.
On the vector intrinsic from K and C, portable for
that's a good question. Many of them are, yeah. They're the exact same interface, yeah, exactly. But some not. It's just that it's you know, I think it should be fully portable, to be honest with you. It's just that there are a lot more of them for AVX 512 than there are for the KNC.
You mentioned about this do you have any name?
If you give me over lunchtime, I'll be able to dig out the names. What is your performance metric? Something to keep in mind when you're buying hardware or when you're comparing hardware platforms against other hardware platforms. So if you're doing any form of benchmarking, if you want to really think about why you're even thinking about Intel, are you interested in performance per system? Are you interested in performance per watt? So that's something that people are becoming more and more interested in, because electricity is costly. Okay, so if you want to run your applications in a data center, for example, by way of the cloud, if you can leverage a more energy efficient platform, you might have significant cost savings. And then performance per cost. Is the Intel Xeon Phi platform more expensive than K40 GPU platform and so forth? So how many watts or how many flops are you getting per dollar, basically? Why compare one coprocessor against two processors? So this is something that's important here, okay? So you don't compare your results on Xeon Phi versus one socket Xeon. So not against a single Xeon chip. Because single Xeon chips don't typically come in favor of just a single socket. They come in two socket form factor. Okay? And the reason they do is because they have the same thermal design power. Right? So the thermal design power of KNC is 250 watts, let's say, depending on its cube. Thermal design power of two socket Ivy bridge is around 250 watts as well. That's why you compare light against light when it comes to thermal design power. Okay? Because what you're really fundamentally interested in is how many G-flops you're getting per watt. The TDP is not a very accurate measure of watt, the wattage that you're using at runtime, but a lot of people use it. What you should really do is measure the energy consumption or the power consumption at runtime. But it's often quite tricky to do that. So KNL, the TDP of KNL, and this is something that's quite nice about KNL, Knight's Landing, is that the TDP is 200 watts. The TDP of two-socket Haswell is 300 watts. So it has a lower TDP than two-socket Haswell. Okay. So it can be genuinely deemed an energy efficient platform. So now we're going to talk about programming options when it comes to Xeon 4. Okay. So we have offload and native modes to start off with. Okay. So the offload mode implies an explicit virtual shared or virtual shared memory. Okay? So, and you typically offload by way of OpenMP 4.0 nowadays. Okay? So you don't you don't share the same address space as you do on the Xeon. Okay, when you're on the Xeon 5. So because of that, we need to explicitly offload data from the Xeon onto the Xeon 4. And here I'm talking about the coprocessor, okay? So the PCIe form factor, Knight's Corner. So there's an example of your host Xeon code and your coprocessor code. So typically the workflow here is you identify a compute-intensive kernel within your application, and then the idea here is that you would use a directive to offload the data structures and the function associated with that kernel to the coprocessor and run that function on the coprocessor. And then when you're finished running on the coprocessor, you then push those data or the resultant data structures back to the host again by way of OpenMP 4.0. There's a performance penalty associated with that. It's the transfer of data over PCIe Express bus. Okay. So there's bandwidth limitations, there's latency limitations associated with PCIe. So you really want to minimize those data transfers as much as possible during the run of your application. Okay? So some optimization techniques is to maybe offload all your data structures at the very beginning of your code, even though you might not need them at that particular point of the code. Just offload them all to the coprocessor, leave them there for the entire runtime, and then just transfer them back at the very end. Because by way of that, you limitate synchronization points between the host and the Xeon 5 coprocessor, which impact performance. So I'm going to stop and ask everyone if they're okay with the offload mode and how it works. So this example here it's a non-open standard offload pragma that's facilitated by way of the Intel compiler. So it's known as Leo. You might see that from time to time, language extensions for offload. It's proprietary, it's developed by Intel, and it's becoming more and more redundant and deprecated because you can now use OpenMP 4. Use OpenMP when you can. Don't go for the non-open standard portable directives or pragmas. What's the point? Okay? There's no benefit from it. And make sure that you're trying to make sure that your software is as portable and as open as possible. And then we have the native mode. So this is a standalone application. It can be an MPI application as well. And the idea here is that you basically just SSH cross-compile on the host, you transfer your binary over to the coprocessor, and then you just run that binary, that executable, natively on the coprocessor by way of SSHing into it, and just running it as you would on an SMP node. So that's what we'll be doing later on, hopefully, if everything works out. So, as I said to you earlier on, think about the coprocessor, because that's what you'll have access to initially. Some of you might be able to access the KNL sooner rather than others. Think of it in more native mode, because you really want to be preparing your software for night's landing, more so than thinking about it as a coprocessor that's going to exist forever. Okay, so it's better to, in my mind anyway, to exploit the KNC native mode and prepare your software for KNL, which is more than likely going to be most popular in its on-socket self-bootable mode. Offload and native mode programming models allow a range of CPU plus mic couplings. I think we've covered that. There's this symmetric mode. So yeah, that's an important point. You see the offload square, the code with highly parallel phases. So someone mentioned to me earlier on about code that has very sequential parts as well. This is where the offload mode might offer up something, because you can run those sequential parts of your code on the Xeon and then offload the highly parallel parts to the coprocessor. And you will do that on KNL as well, if it's a heterogeneous KNL Xeon system. But I recommend, if you're using an MPI application, think about doing that with MPI rather than offload mode. On that note, here's how you do that with MPI. So with MPI, just as you use hybrid MPI OpenMP models, you can use a hybrid MPI plus offload model as well. It's OpenMP now, anyway, OpenMP 4.0. So you'd have your, as I mentioned to you earlier on, you'd have your MPI process running on the Xeon, and that process would offload the data structures and the function to the coprocessor, run it on the coprocessor, and then by way of the offloading model, transfer those data structures back to the MPI process running on the host, and then just carry on. So there's nothing that complex about that. And then we have the alternative model, which is so-called MPI symmetric mode. That's the really neat thing about the KNL, or the KNC even, the Xeon Phi, is that you can run MPI on it. So you can't run MPI on cheapy GPUs. Okay, so you can have an MPI process running on the KNC, and you can have an MPI process running on the Xeon, both within the same communicator. Okay, both within MPI kernels, for example, and they can communicate with each other just as they would in a regular MPI application running on a regular Xeon cluster. The issue here is that you're dealing with a heterogeneous system, and you're dealing with a heterogeneous network in some sense as well, because you have this PCIe bus to contend with in terms of data transfers between those two MPI processes, one sitting on the host and one sitting on the KNC. So that MPI process sitting on the host might also be communicating with MPI processes on another Xeon host off node, and there's a bandwidth and a latency associated with that transfer, but there's an entirely different one associated with the MPI process that's sitting on the KNC that this process is also communicating with. So you can see that there are real issues when it comes to load balancing there as well. So that's tricky. And coming back to the offload model, in some sense, the offload model makes it easier to load balance than the MPI symmetric model, because you're isolating the section of code that you're offloading to the coprocessor. Whereas everybody knows that MPI is a much more kind of pervasive programming model that touches on, lots of different parts of a very large code. So in that sense, MPI is a more complex programming model than OpenMP effectively. Any questions on that? Because now we're going to move on to vectorization. So as mentioned to you earlier on, I'm not going to talk about offloading today, because I think people should steer their minds away from that. Now that KNL is an on-socket solution, and it's typically not the major performance limitation in applications. I'm trying to target info, because often you can hide those data transfers as well by way of asynchronous communications, and by way of hiding the communications in some way, or by way of non-blocking communications. So there are ways you can alleviate that penalty associated with PCIe transfers. So I don't think it should be that big a concern. What's much more of a concern is actually getting the performance on the coprocessor. Never mind the data transfers too. They're not the major issue. So I think everybody should be familiar with vectorization as a concept. If any of you have done linear algebra courses, you're certainly familiar with it as a concept. Okay? So in terms of vectorization, the paradigm is single instruction multiple data. Okay? So that with a single instruction, you can operate on multiple data. Okay? So because you're dealing with 512-bit wide vector units, if you're dealing with single precision data sets, then you can operate on 16 data elements per cycle by way of the VPUs. Okay? So it's a form of parallelism, it's data parallelism. Okay? And it's obviously represented quite straightforwardly by that schema there. Okay? The point to emphasize when it comes to Xeon Phi, and I'll be emphasizing it time and time again, is that if you don't vectorize your algorithm, you won't benefit from the performance gains that the Xeon Phi can offer. The wider the instruction set, typically the more you have to try and leverage vectorization. Okay? So the typical workflow of vectorization is that step one, you load your array into a vector register. So then you basically operate on the vector registers. Okay, and those vector registers are 512-bit wide. They're limited in the amount of them as well, and then you store the result back to memory. Okay, so it's really not that different to serial code in some sense. But what's difficult is to make sure that you're getting those unit stride accesses, as I mentioned earlier on. Another thing that you need to really care about when it comes to Xeon Phi is that your data objects are well aligned. Because if they're not aligned, you're going to suffer from performance penalties as well. Okay? So typically, if you're looking at nested loops, okay, so if any of you are working on stencil codes, for example, where you find out difference codes, you're often using, because you're working in three-dimensional space, you're working in three-level nested loops, X, Y, and Z. Okay, and you might move over in terms of that, in terms of those directions. So it's typically the innermost loop that you vectorize, and the outer loops are typically multi-threaded. Okay. That's not to say you can't vectorize over the outer loops as well. But most effective vectorization typically comes by way of vectorization of the innermost loop. So here's a history of vector instruction vector instruction sets. Okay, so you saw MMX was the earliest one in '97. It was available on Pentium, 64-bit vector registers, and now more recently, we have AVX2 on Haswell, available since 2003, 256-bit wide. It targets integers, floating point, and additional instructions. The IMCI instruction set was available on Knight's Corner as of 2012, 512-bit instruction registers. Targets 32 and 64-bit integers, and single and double precision floating point. And the same goes for AVX 512, which is available as of Monday last week. So here we touch on this concept of automatic factorization of loops. Okay, so you have a code like this on the right. Okay, so you're just doing some sort of addition of data elements within this, or accumulation of data elements within these arrays A and B. Okay, so you can see that in the middlemost loop. This loop will be auto-vectorized. The only thing you needed to do in the code in order to make sure that you gained the performance that you'd expect on KNC is you needed to align your data structures. Okay, and you can see the declarations that were required to do that at the top of the code snippet. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later on as well. Okay. So on the right hand side, you can see command line, and you can see how we compile that code. Okay. So the only thing we needed to do was nothing, basically. Just needed to compile it with the latest C++ Intel compiler. And we can see from a vectorization report that I'll touch on in a moment or two that the loop was fully vectorized. But you can see that, so you're, in this sense, you're exploiting AVX512 straight away through automatic vectorization. But you can see that the loop wasn't very complex. Okay. Unit stride accesses, no problem in that regard. So that's an example, albeit a very trivial one, of automatic vectorization. Okay, so all you have to do is pass the right flag. Okay, so in order to ensure that you're targeting AVX512, what you should really see in the command line here is a switch, a flag for -x mic, because we're targeting Xeon -AVX512. And then we definitely ensure that we're vectorizing for AVX512 on the KNL. What can be automatically vectorized? So here are limitations when it comes to automatic vectorization. Only for and do loops, if you're using Fortran, can be auto-vectorized. The number of iterations must be known at runtime or compilation time. So that's quite important. Okay? So if the compiler doesn't know the trip count of the loop, it more than likely won't vectorize it. So if the trip count is only determined at runtime, then it's going to cause problems. Okay? Now, there are ways you can get around that. I mean, we might touch on them later on, but typically you'll only really benefit from or get auto-vectorization if the trip counts of the loops are known. By default, compiler targets the innermost loop for vectorization. I mentioned that earlier on. Okay. Memory access in the loop must have a regular pattern, ideally with unit stride. If the compiler sees an irregular pattern with non-unit stride that it doesn't like, and more so than irregular patterns, if it thinks that there's a dependency there, it'll opt for safety, and it won't vectorize, auto-vectorize your loop. Okay. So even if there are no dependencies within your loop, it might think that there are, and it won't vectorize. So that's where you step in as the software developer and tell the compiler by way of pragmas that no, there are no dependencies in this loop, and you can go ahead and vectorize. So this is often the reason why a lot of software doesn't auto-vectorize, because the compiler thinks that there are dependencies that there may not be. Okay. Now, when it comes to non-unit stride accesses, it may well still try to auto-vectorize, and it may actually do a fairly decent job of it. So even if you have these gathers and scatters, okay, because of the non-unit stride, there are gather and scatter instructions, and as mentioned earlier on, they're now hardware supported by KNL. So even if you have non-unit stride access, you can still benefit from vectorization, and the compiler will probably still go ahead and auto-vectorize, and you will see benefits from it. What cannot be automatically vectorized? Non-standard loops that cannot be automatically vectorized. Loops with irregular memory access patterns, we mentioned those already. Calculations with vector dependence, mentioned those already. While loops, or for or do loops with underdetermined number of iterations, or undetermined, sorry. Outer loops, unless you use a pragma omp SIMD directive, which overrides this restriction. And I have seen benefits from vectorizing outer loops as well, so it's something to bear in mind. Loops with complex branches, so if you have a lot of if-else conditions within your loop, the compiler might not auto-vectorize because of that. But now, because there are mask instructions and mask registers, it may well go ahead and auto-vectorize as well. There's a lot of effort that went into masking for the KNL AVX512 instruction set, so you will still see vectorization even within loops that have if-else branches as well. But as long as they're not overly complex. And anything else that cannot be or is very difficult to vectorize. So directive guided vectorization. So this is, again, kind of a middle ground between auto-vectorization and intrinsics. Okay, so this is where there is some explicit vectorization going on by you, the developer, because you're using pragmas to do it, okay? So you use pragma, a statement pragma omp SIMD is used to enforce vectorizations of loops, which includes loops with SIMD-enabled functions, second innermost loops, could be third innermost loops, could be, what that basically means is the innermost loop, okay? Failed vectorization due to compiler decisions. So again, coming back to that point, if the compiler thinks that there are dependencies there that are not there, then you can just insert this pragma on SIMD and say, just go ahead and vectorize. So this is the most aggressive directive for vectorization. It's basically saying to the compiler, don't worry about anything, just vectorize that damn loop for me. Okay? And also for the consequences. Loops where guidance is required, so vector length reduction. So the vector length clause can tell the compiler what the vector length of the structure you're using is. So, for example, if you're using single precision data structures for targeting KNL, your vector length might be 16 wide. Okay. There are also reduction clauses. There are also clauses for telling the compiler what the trip count is for the loop as well, if it's not easily determinable by the compiler. So see the OpenMP 4.0 standard or compiler's reference on pragma SIMD. So there is also this pragma SIMD directive there as well. That's the non-open standard version available by way of the Intel compiler. Don't use it, use OpenMP 4.0 instead. And do check out the OpenMP 4.0 standard to find out more information. So here is an example of pragma SIMD in action. So here I've gone against myself here because I'm giving an example of pragma SIMD when I should be giving an example of pragma omp SIMD. We won't be too particular about it for the purposes of this course. So it should be pragma omp SIMD there as well. Okay, so here you're vectorizing out of outside of, you're not vectorizing in the innermost loop here, okay? Because the innermost loop has a much shorter trip count than the loop just above it. So it's better to vectorize over high trip count loops rather than short trip count loops. Because there's an association there's an overhead basically from the vectorization process by way of an epilogue and prologue overhead that's associated with the compiler aligning data structures, the peeling that it has to do at the start of an innermost loop and so forth. And those overheads are hidden that bit more the longer the trip count is for the innermost loops. So you're dealing with very short trip count loops that are, let's say, 16 in iteration counts. So a trip count of 16, which is the same amount as the vector registers, then you're going to suffer because there's going to be a high overhead associated with loading the data into the vector units and so forth. Okay, so you're better off going for trip counts that are much longer. So with that pragma SIMD, you can ensure that the K loop there is vectorized free. So it's as simple as that. So your loop was vectorized, now what? So you need to ensure that you have unit stride access, because you can vectorize without unit stride access, as mentioned before, but you're going to suffer from the fact that you have gathers and scatters because of your non-unit stride access. So why not try to think about a refactoring of your algorithm that will allow for unit stride accesses? You need to align your data structures. I'll be touching on that a little bit later on. You need to pad multi-dimensional containers to make sure that that alignment is correct, to avoid false aliasing, to avoid false sharing, and so forth. You need to eliminate peel loops, which the compiler will implement to make sure that the data structures are properly aligned for what it does eventually vectorize. So these are these are associated with loops that might not have trip counts that are multiples of 16, for example, if you're using single precision on KNL. You need to eliminate multi-versioning, which is the same as aliasing. You need to optimize data reuse and caches, because as we touched on this morning, if your memory bandwidth limited, you won't benefit from vectorizing your code. Okay? So you need to make sure that your data sits in cache as much as possible to properly exploit vectorization. So if your data is served by off-chip RAM and not caches, it does not matter if you have vectorization, you will be bottlenecked by memory access. So extensions for array notation. So array notation is a method for specifying slices of arrays, as you see them here, with begin and length as arguments. A stride with begin, length, and stride. And then multi-dimensional arrays as well. So is anyone using array notation? Obviously the person using Fortran is using array notation. So you can use array notation in C, C++, by way of Silk. I'm not too sure if any of you have used Silk before. But Silk is a language extension to C++ offered by Intel that now allows for array notation the same way you use it in Fortran. I think array notation is quite a nice feature of Fortran, and it does help when it comes to vectorization as well. So that's Silk Plus. It's non-open standard, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see array notation as part of the C standard or C++ standard at some point. SIMD-enabled functions. What if the implementation of the function is in a separate source code file? Okay, so here you have a simple add, my simple add function, just adding two scalars together. Will eventually add two vectors together when we vectorize the function. But this function exists in another source file. So the compiler will refuse to automatically vectorize this function or this loop. So the solution is to design and declare the function as SIMD-enabled. You can do that by way of non-standard decorators, like the attribute decorator that you see there. So that's available by way of the Intel compiler. But what I would recommend instead is using pragma omp declare SIMD just above that function. And that will ensure that the function will be vectorized. So that's the open standard alternative. Or you could use pragma SIMD. Or sorry, no, the point here is that when using SIMD enable functions, make sure that you use pragma SIMD or pragma omp SIMD just above the loop body of the function as well. So in this case, automatic vectorization succeeds. So is that clear to everyone, or is that confusing? Sure. So assume vector dependence. True vector dependence makes vectorization impossible. There's no doubt about that. Okay? So true vector dependence. So there is an example of where we see dependence on the previous elements within that loop body there. So that would typically result in a rate race condition if we try to multi-thread it. Assumed vector dependence, this is when the compiler cannot determine whether vector dependence exists or not. And in this case, auto vectorization will fail when it really shouldn't if the dependence isn't there. Okay. So if you use the vectorization report at compile time, it'll report that in this example here, the lower left example, the loop was not vectorized, non-vectorizable loop instance from multi-versioning. Okay? So that's the same as aliasing. So it suggests that it is actually vectorizable, but we might need to give the compiler a few hints. And one way we can do that is use ifdep. So to ignore assumed vector dependence, use pragma ifdep or pragma simd. So ifdep means there's non-vector dependence there in the loop. There's no vector dependence in the loop, okay? Which is the case for this loop. And it gets rid of the aliasing issue that the compiler was confused by, and now the compiler is, or now the loop is fully vectorized. Okay? So there's a lot of issues there within your code that might be quite easily fixable. Correct. So in that sense, use pragma simd. There are subtle differences between the two, but my understanding is that for all intents and purposes, they do the same thing. Data alignment requirements. So for Intel Xeon Phi 2nd generation, which is the last line there, you need to make sure that your data structure, your array, is 64-bit aligned, 64-byte aligned to a cache boundary. Okay, so your caches on the KNL are 65-bit, or 65-byte wide. Okay, and you need to make sure that your data structures are properly aligned to those boundaries. Okay, so that's something that's important to know. Now, you won't suffer as much on KNL as you did on KNC if your data is not properly aligned. But you will still suffer a measurable performance impact if your data structure is not aligned. So data alignment on the stack and the heap. So if you want to align data that's on the stack, you just use the direct decorator you see there. Underscore attribute underscore align 64, because you're aligning to 64-byte cache blocks. So the address A0 here is a multiple of 64, i.e. it's aligned on a 64-byte boundary. Alignment of memory blocks on the heap. So you do this with a specific type of malloc. It's underscore underscore malloc, and you just pass this extra argument of 64, which implies a 64-bit byte alignment on the cache block. You use malloc and free are aligned versions of malloc and free.
How do we determine what the number should be, the alignment number? So
whether it's 64 or 32, for example. Okay. So you really need to look at that from the specs of the system that you're running on. So it depends on the L1 cache and what its size is effectively. Okay. So certainly, I mean, it's just something that you need to know beforehand. So for KNL, KNC, it's 64 byte. For Xeon, Ivy Bridge, 32 byte.
And that's the size of the L1 cache, or?
Yeah. So data alignment hints. Programmer may promise to the compiler under penalty of segmentation fault that alignment has been taken care of. So you might be aligning to the cache line, but the compiler might not recognize that. Okay. later on when you get to your kernel, and you want to ensure that the compiler knows that the data structure is aligned to the cache line. So you can use these pragmas like pragma vector aligned, but when you do that, you need to ensure that you have properly aligned the data structure, because if you don't, you'll get a segmentation fault.
Another question, isn't the data aligned by default when you have an array, for example? And now you have double. Do you actually need to tell the compiler that it's aligned for pragma 1P CMD to work properly?
The pragma simply will work anyway, but you haven't guaranteed that your data is aligned, that's for sure. And the only way you can do that is by doing that on with the decorator on the stack, or by doing it via specific mallocs for the heap. It's the only way you can ensure that the data is aligned. So it's important that you do that, certainly on KNC, to a lesser extent on KML. And then to use aligned instructions, you may need to pad inner dimension of multi-dimensional arrays to a multiple of 16, or in the case of single precision, or 8 for double precision elements as well. So that's just padding with zeros for certain dimensions of your array to ensure that that alignment is happening for multi-dimensional arrays. Just to ensure that every row of your multi-dimensional array is properly aligned. So we've mentioned quite a few times this unit stride access issue. So unit stride access is optimal. There's no doubt about it, okay? So there's an example of unit stride access in the topmost code snippet. Non-unit stride access is slower, and there's an example in the lower code snippet. Okay? So if you're accessing your data by way of specific offsets, those accesses are non-unit stride accesses. If they're random in nature, then you suffer that bit more. If they're non-random, then there's some sort of deterministic access that's happening. The compiler might be able to do some sort of optimization so that it's using efficient gathers and scatters. So there's a schematic of non-unit stride accesses there on the leftmost schematic. It typically comes about by way of using array structures rather than structured arrays. Okay? So you can see all these accesses, non-unit stride accesses into the vector register from main memory. And on the right, if you have nice contiguous data unit stride accesses, you can see that you get these nice unit stride accesses into the vector register, and that comes by way of using a structured arrays data structure. So this is often given as an example because in a lot of codes, people have used arrays of structures for quite some time because it's a more elegant way of coding, but in terms of performance, you can suffer quite dramatically. So there's a big push on to get people using structures and arrays, which can often result in kind of quite non-trivial refactoring of code. So detecting available instructions, you can do this by doing cat proc CPU info. You can determine what the instruction sets, what instruction sets are supported by the processor that we're working on. And then you can, by way of if-defs, develop your software such that it'll go down a certain code path if it's SSE that's being supported on the platform, or go down a separate code path if AVX 512 is being supported on the platform. I think developing in that way is not a great design approach. It's going to cause issues when it comes to maintainability and so forth. There would be a reason to do it if you're using intrinsics. But if you're using high-level abstractions like OpenP for vectorizing code, I don't see why you would need to do this. if you want to find out more about intrinsics, there's the Intel Intrinsics Guide, so there's the link for it. So it has all the different vector instruction sets. It's quite nifty. It's quite a nifty tool because you can isolate which ones you're interested in quite quickly. And there's an explanation for each. So here's an example of Coulomb's law using an array of structures. As mentioned before, it's elegant but inefficient. So the loop, as you see there, will be auto-vectorized. So there's your structure, your charge structure there. And it's using an array of these structures. Okay, so the loop will vectorize, there's no doubt about that. But your accesses will be non-unit stride accesses within this loop. So you suffer performance load. So what you really want to do is change your data structure so that you're using a structure of arrays, okay? So it's quite straightforward to do that, but where it can be quite tricky is later on in the code. And we saw an example of the result of that, and it's simply that you get unit stride accesses rather than non-unit stride accesses. There's a version of the code where the accesses are unit stride accesses and where the data structure has been changed so that we're now working with an array of structures. Or sorry, structure of arrays. And here's the performance improvement that you get from doing that. So with the non-unit stride accesses, you can see the performance in gigaflops on the host system, which is a Xeon Ivy Bridge system. So you get 129 gigaflops per second versus 189 on the Intel Xeon Phi coprocessor. So the Xeon Phi is not doing that much better in terms of performance. And then if you change to a structure of arrays data structure where you have the unit stride accesses, you can see that you're getting quite a significant performance boost. You're getting around 500 gigaflops per second versus 230 on the Xeon. So you can see that that change in data structure is that bit more sensitive for the Xeon Phi than it was for the Xeon. And then if you use a lax precision, which in this particular example was using single point precision for square roots, you can see that you can get quite a dramatic performance boost.
So why does the host benefit from using a lax precision?
That's a good question. That's a good question, and I don't know the answer for that one. I'll have to check that out. But certainly, I know that the relaxed precision on Xeon Phi is still, KNC is still software emulated, whereas now on KNL, it's hardware supported. So you'll see an even more dramatic speed up on KNL than you will on KNC. But it's quite a bit of a mystery to me as to why you don't see the performance improvement on Hasmol. Let me see if I can figure out the answer to that. So that's vectorization covered. Everyone feel comfortable on that? Any questions? No? So we'll move over to trading.
Just one question. It's probably a very good question, but so is there statistics of how successful a compiler is in automatically vectorizing the code without any support on new generations of compilers?
I don't think there is. What I can say is that the compiler is getting better and better at auto-vectorizing. And what I will say on that note is that it's very, very important to keep up to date with compiler versions, because you can really see significant performance improvements, especially nowadays, from updates to your compiler. And the reason why is because Intel have put a lot of effort and man hours into improving their compiler for vectorization for obvious reasons. They're pushing a chip onto the market that has very wide vector units and can only benefit from reworking them efficiently. So there's a huge amount of effort going on in Intel to improve the compiler in terms of auto vectorization. So there's an interesting anecdote on this. A couple of weeks back, or maybe months ago, back in February, we did a course on Intel Xeon Phi here in Dublin, and we had this really neat example of how you could go about optimizing a given kernel in terms of vectorization by hand, because the compiler wasn't doing a good job of it. And we had this brilliant example, and we were really enthusiastic about it. And then we tried it out the day before the course, and the auto vectorizer did it all for us. So there was no benefit from teaching it the next day. And that came about from an update that had only been done the night before, and the previous compiler had only been released about 4 days before that as well, the previous compiler version. So that's another thing you'll see at Intel is that compiler versions are being updated much more rapidly now.
And how do other compilers compared to?
I think so. GCC is doing a good job nowadays, and is often comparable with the Intel compiler in terms of performance. Particular vectorization, I'm not too sure right now at the moment. But GCC is doing a really, really good job at the moment. But I think that stems from investments by Intel and GCC as well. They're more and more strongly backing GCC. And then, I mean, what other compilers are there out there?
Cloud, for example.
Clang. Okay, so Clang. Yeah, so again, Intel are investing a lot of money and effort into Clang as well. But there are problems for Intel when it comes to Clang because their optimizers, in their compiler, have been built up over years, and anyone that's looked at GCC, it's a nightmare. And to disentangle the optimizer from that framework and to target Clang and LLVM is a big job. And there's no doubt that they're putting effort into it, but it's a big challenge for them. The other compiler out there, I don't know if anyone uses PGI, so if you're interested in GPUs, you might use PGI, but no, performance-wise, it's not as good as Intel or GCC. Okay, so here's our processor hierarchy. So I'm sure you've seen this as part of the course in some form or another. We have the Intel Xeon processor. It's often divvied up in terms of packages. Each package has multiple cores. Each core has multiple processors. Core presents itself as 2 or 4 logical processors due to two-way hyperthreading on Xeon, or 4 hardware threads per core on Xeon Phi. The terminology we're using is that an operating system process is a numeric ID of a logical processor, and a software thread is a stream of instructions in the process. The jargon is that a physical core equals core, and a logical core equals a logical processor. So I'm sure you've gone through all of that already as part of the course. If not, then feel free to ask questions. So scalability expectations. Again, you've probably touched on this a fair bit. You have T number of threads. Your speed up is calculated by the performance you get with T threads versus the performance you get with 1 thread. Okay, so that's a naive interpretation of speed up, but it works. Okay, we might interpret it in different ways, but let's say it's that for the moment. And then efficiency is just as important metric, if not more important, is the speed up you get with T threads versus the number of threads. Okay, so that's your parallel efficiency. And then you get linear scaling if your speed up for T threads is equal to the thread count. Okay, so here's an example of a speed up plot on CPU architecture. So you can see you get nice nice linear speed up. Typically, you're dealing with a compute bound problem here, represented by a direct n-body simulation up to, let's say, 28 cores. Beyond that, we're using hyperthreading, so the speed up typically drops off at the point of leveraging the hyperthreads. And because of that, what I would often recommend, or what I really encourage people to do, is rather than scale across all of the hyperthreads available to you, so all of the full thread count, i.e. 56 in this case, don't scale out as far as 56 threads in this case. Scale up as far as 28 hardware cores that are available to you, and go up as far as that, and then see what performance improvement you get by way of a separate scalability curve that includes the two hyperthreads, to see if you're getting a lift in terms of the performance from the hyperthreads, because that's a fairer comparison. Because no one is expecting that scalability will improve beyond the 28 hardware cores on the platform. You would expect some sort of saturation or fall off beyond the 28 hardware cores in this example. You're dealing with a bandwidth bound problem, so stream triad is a benchmark example here. Then you're going to suffer in terms of scalability, because the real limitation is the memory bandwidth, not the parallelism by way of core count. And here it's the same for the Intel Xeon Phi, so we see the same thing. We're scaling up to 120 threads in this case for our bandwidth bound and compute bound problems. So we see we get nice linear scaling up to 120 threads, okay? Because as mentioned to you earlier on, that second hardware thread is very, very beneficial on the KNC, okay? Whereas when you go to the hyperthreads on the Xeon, you don't see the same sort of benefit. Okay, so you're getting really nice linear scaling up to 122 threads on KNC, and then you see the fall off because of your bandwidth limitations for the memory bandwidth problem on KNC. So we have various different threading frameworks available to us. First is POSIX, P-threads. Does anyone use P-threads?
I use
Just
for practice.
Just to practice, yeah.
For understanding.
Yeah. I don't see any real reason why people should use P-threads. Other than curiosity. You can give me a good reason. I'm interested. Various implementations, complexity simple, functionality manually control everything. SILP Plus is something that I mentioned to you earlier on. It's offered by way of Intel. It's public. It's open. As far as I know, it's open. Very simple in terms of complexity. If you're a C++ programmer, if you're not a C++ programmer, it's not. So I think that depends on people's views and interpretations of what's simple, right? Automatic loop, loops and task, no user control. It's very neat, C++. It's got a lot of power, but you need to know your C++ to a certain extent. It uses a lot of lambda functions and so forth. So does TPB. It's public, it's open, it's more complex, it's very powerful. It's a very interesting programming model and programming tool, but it's not an open standard. So think about whether you really want to use it. It's a C++ template library effectively. Some of its performance design goals are quite interesting, and they've had quite a lot of success. In terms of its task scheduler, for example, it's very, very efficient, and much more efficient than the OpenMP's task scheduler. So if you're using the tasking model within OpenMP, it might be interesting for you to have a look at TBB if you're suffering a performance penalty from task scheduler. OpenMP, various implementations, simple to complex. HPC specific functionality, automatic and manual control possible. So OpenMP it's an okay standard. as to whether it's meeting all of the requirements of extreme scale HPC. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But again, that community is releasing versions of the standard much more rapidly than it used to. So they're definitely, they see a need to rapidly improve the standard.
And can I ask something? So there is recently, since C++11, there was this STD threads, which is now part of the
Standard
language. Yes.
Yep, and you can use that.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Okay. Does it compare well to the others, or?
I don't really know the performance results on it. I haven't tried it out myself. I know one or two colleagues that did, but I didn't hear from them, to be honest with you. But it's interesting though, maybe worth checking out. Coexistence with vectors is pretty straightforward. You obviously multi-thread over the cores, your hardware threads, and you vectorize on your GPU units. And now, as of OpenMP4, you have the same programming API for targeting both. Thread affinity, usually important. Did you talk about it during the course at all? Very, very, very important on Xeon Phi. The Xeon Phi platform is hugely sensitive to thread affinity. So OpenMP threads may migrate between cores according to the OS decisions that are being made. Okay? So if your thread initially launches on one core, it might hop to another core during runtime. And you're going to suffer from performance issues because of that. So what you really want to do is you want to forbid the migration of threads between cores to improve locality, okay, and increase performance for the engine. So this is just a schematic of threads hopping around between cores on a Xeon platform. So there are various different thread affinity models or thread affinity patterns, and they're offered up to you by way of the OpenMP standard. Okay, so generally beneficial for compute-bound applications. So this is the compact pattern that we're talking about here. Okay, so you can see your hardware threads on each core there. Okay, and you can see your thread ID numbers on there, right? So your OpenMP threads. And what this assures is that the threads are pinned in a compact manner so that nearest neighbor threads end up on nearest neighbor cores. Okay? And that they stay that way. They're pinned to those cores throughout the runtime. So they're not hopping about anymore during runtime. So massive gains from that, from pinning the threads to cores and pinning them in a certain manner. And then you have the scatter pattern. So generally beneficial for bandwidth-bound applications. So in this way, you have your thread IDs, you have your core IDs, your hardware thread IDs as well. And this, for this pattern, this model, ensures that the threads get spread out in a round-robin fashion on each of the cores, so that they're not tightly packed together on each of the cores and on each of the sockets. Okay. So if you have 60 threads and you have 60 cores, don't forget that there's 4 hardware threads per core on the KNC. So what you're ensuring in this sense is that thread 1 gets assigned to core 0, let's say, and the next thread that gets assigned will be assigned to core 1, okay? Not the hardware thread on core 0 or the next available hardware thread on core 0. So what that can often do is it can alleviate any kind of pressure that's due to sharing the same cache, for example. So if multiple threads, so the 4 hardware threads on the KNC share the same L2 cache, and if they're all accessing the same L2 cache, there can be benefits to that, but there can often be drawbacks as well. Okay, there's contention there for the same L2 cache. And in that case, you might want to spread your threads out so that they're not sharing the same L2 cache. So there are environment variables to set these affinities. The environment variable is KNP_affinity, and it's quite easy to set. There are different options. The most important ones are compact and scatter, as I mentioned to you as well. Compact places threads as close to each other as possible. Scatter places threads as far from each other as possible. And to be honest with you, the only way you can really find out is by trial and error. Okay? More often than not, you can make sense of what affinity works after the fact rather than before the fact. Okay? So it's quite hard to determine which one is best suited to your workload. And it's quite easy to change the affinity setting. But whatever you do, try out multiple affinity settings, because you will really see substantial performance changes between them. So here's just a topic on dealing with insufficient parallelism. So maybe you touched on this before. So this is an example of where you might have an outer loop that has a very low trip count. And it's typically the outermost loop that you want to multi-thread over. So in this example, m is equal to 4 is small, and it's smaller than the number of threads on Z05. So what it basically means is that it's difficult to expose a lot of parallelism there, right? Because the trip count is low. And n is equal to 10, and n is large enough so that the matrix doesn't fit in cache. It's an extra consideration. So have any of you used the V-tune profiler? Yeah. So it's a very sophisticated performance profiler owned by Intel. And if you're really interested in getting performance from your software and you have it available, I think it's a very useful tool. As to interpreting the metrics and understanding all the metrics, it can be challenging sometimes, but Intel are releasing more and more tutorials and so forth on doing this. So I think it'll be more widely used as a tool than it has been to date. So we can see that only 4 threads are being effectively used there, shown up by the brown color. So the rest of the threads are effectively spinning, and they're not being used for the workload of interest. Okay? So they're not effective. So only 4 of our threads are effective. Just to get a nice profile shot of that. So then what we can do is we can use OpenMP loop collapse, the collapse clause. So what it does is it collapses those 2 outermost loops that we saw in the previous snippet, so that it effectively increases the trip count. Okay? So that you have effectively exposed much more parallelism to the OpenMP compiler. And it's as simple as that. You need to make sure that there are no dependency issues as a result of collapsing the 2 outermost loops. But once you've done that, you'll see that because of the higher trip count, so you effectively just have 1 outermost loop that has a very high trip count there, that all your other threads are now being effectively used, and the ones that we saw spinning previously are no longer spinning. Nice, quick optimization that leads to a significant performance improvement. And here is that performance improvement. So you can see that by way of the collapse in the rightmost column, you can see that you've got quite a significant improvement over the unoptimized version, which is in the leftmost column. Okay? So what this plot really highlights is that if you have an unoptimized version of your code on Intel Xeon Phi, it's not going to run well. You're not going to achieve performance. It's from these key performance considerations and optimizations that it's the only way you're really going to leverage the Xeon Phi. So it's 12:30 now, and I think we're going to break for lunch. I've finished the threading section, and we're going to go on to memory optimizations next. So at this point, do we have any questions on threading or vectorization? I don't want to teach you that OpenMP because I think you already know it, or you probably already covered it. And that's why I'm not showing a lot about OpenMP, because as a standard, you've probably learned enough about it already. And the only thing that's of interest when it comes to Xeon Phi with regard to OpenMP 4.0 is the SIMD features of OpenMP, which are quite easy to use. The other ones offload, and we're not talking about offload today. So I'm talking more about Xeon Phi as an architecture platform and performance considerations on a general basis that you should take into account.
Actually, a question about OpenMP. On the previous slide, there is a program OpenMP atomic.
Yes.
What's useful?
So that's to ensure that your data accesses are atomic in nature. So that there is a data dependency there in your loop, that you're basically atomizing the accesses and any accumulation that's going on there so that you avoid any data race conditions. So the other option is to use OpenMP critical. You'll see that as an option, but don't use critical because you suffer from performance bottlenecks much more so with critical than you do atomic. So better to use atomic than critical. So it ensures that you don't have any race conditions, which you might have typically in induction type patterns.
About the activity, how does the subnuma activity match with the thread activity? Can you have control both the same time from the NUMA control?
So when it comes to NUMA, the way you ensure that you're accessing data from the memory that's closest to you is, and I'm going to mention this later on, is that you initialize your data structure in the exact same way as you traverse it by way of multi-threading your loop. And that's the only thing you need to do. And that's the so-called first touch policy. And that's the only NUMA consideration you need to worry about. And then affinity is a separate issue then.
So the memory thing you can, or the KNC, you can just estimate for the higher level memory, not the cache level, for example.
Yeah.
So if you have just two NUMA nodes on a KNC.
On KNC, you only have the one NUMA node.
One.
Yeah. Because there's no NUMA node on the KNC.
On the one on the first slide, there were two NUMA nodes, one on the DDR memory and one on the.
And that's the KNL.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I said KNC when I was
Yeah. So on KNL, you have two NUMA nodes, effectively correct. So indeed, you have to take NUMA into consideration with regards to the MCD RAM. And you also have to take it into consideration because of this sub-NUMA configuration that's possible on the KNL as well. But again, it comes back to having a NUMA-aware code. The only thing you really need to have with regards to a NUMA-aware code is that first touch policy when it comes to initializing the data. If you're using MPI, it'll be much more easy. You just have a single MPI process per NUMA node. Any other questions?
If we consider an hybrid code where we use MPI and NP,
Yeah.
and then we run it just as pure MPI.
Pure MPI, yeah.
The OpenMP instruction, does it slow down the code? Is it better to exclude the OpenMP instruction? Or?
So if I understand correctly, you have a hybrid code, but you're only ever using it in MPI mode. Is that pretty much? Okay, so if you're doing that, then you're making sure that you set the OpenMP environment variable so that you're only using one thread, right?
Yes.
So you might get a little bit of a performance impact. There might be some overhead, yeah, certainly. But I don't think it's anything to be concerned about. Because the major overhead with OpenMP is the spawning of thread pools. And that becomes more of an overhead if there are more threads. If there's only one thread, then it's not much of a performance issue.
A related question. So if you spawn a thread pool, if a thread pool was spawned by OMP in a given method, when you go out of that method and you, for example, you proceed some other calculations, and then there's another OMP region encountered, is the thread pool discarded?
Yes,
after leaving?
yes, and there's overhead associated with that.
Okay.
So it's an interesting topic. point. So in order to ensure that doesn't lead to performance implications, it's better to spawn the pool once and keep it alive throughout the runtime. Because you don't want to keep creating and killing OpenMP regions. There's a price to be paid, definitely.
So it's better to open the parallel region and then
Open it for as long as you can.
okay.
Yeah, that's basically it.
That's good.
Lunch?
I guess if there's no more questions, yes. And we're back here at 2 o'clock. Got some time
This
to.
one or in the other one?
No, we're going to stay here, I think, just because I'm not sure what's going on with the building works there. So we have this group booked now for the rest of the week. So I think we might just stay here now, moving into the rest. Let's try and use this room, I think, for the rest of the week. I think best idea, just because I don't know what they're doing with that building works. So I'm going to be quiet here. Yes, sure. So back into I just got some timetables here for Wednesday. What's going on Wednesday?
Tomorrow will be.
They're on the web page as well. So. Oh, sorry. So we're back here at 2 o'clock, okay?
So I'm going to.
So you're going to leave the laptop here, right? So sorry? You're going to leave the laptop here, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll get the room.
Okay.